Welcome everyone and thank you for joining our webinar today. My name is Brian Young and I am the Vice President of Advisor Services here at AdvisorAssist. I know that we are joined here today by many of our clients, but for those of you that don't know our firm, AdvisorAssist is a consulting firm that provides comprehensive and turnkey regulatory and risk management solutions to RIAs. We work with hundreds of RIAs across the country and a few abroad, but what sets us apart is our approach, which we will give you a taste of here today. As practitioners, we have the experience and know-how of not only compliance, but operations, strategy, technology, all of which is involved in running an RIA. So as such, we're able to provide more practical solutions to help you manage your regulatory risk. So before we get started, if you should have any questions during the webinar, there is a chat window on the right-hand side, or we will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and we'll make sure to send everyone a copy. So I'm joined here by my colleagues, Chris Wynn and Michael Conlon. Chris is our CEO and lead consultant, and Michael is our VP of Compliance and General Counsel. So guys, at this point, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Chris Wynn here, folks. Thank you for taking the time this afternoon. Cybersecurity is quite possibly one of the biggest risks that you face as a registered investment advisor these days. And, the reason for the risk being so high is we don't know where it's coming from. Is it someone in an internet cafe in Russia, or are they sitting down in the lobby of your office? Or while you're, cruising through Starbucks, are they there, spoofing and/or trying to get into, apps on your phone. So we're going to dig into really the practical aspects of, what can you do, to protect yourselves. As we know, the only certainty that's out there is just not to be in the business. And I'm assuming by being on this call, you've made the decision that, well, that's not an option. So we have to come up with our plan B of, how do we mitigate the risk. So let us Michael will just take you through just kind of the overview of what is cybersecurity and what the regulators are doing about it. And then I will talk about the firm's approach and how it will vary greatly just depending on how you're structured, both from an office location, the technologies that you utilize, the approach that you take in servicing your clients. And then we'll delve into some of the other areas around the rules and regulations and some of the practical aspects of preparing yourself for all of the rules and security requirements that you'll need to deal with along the way here.
Thank you, Chris, and good day, everybody. Thank you for joining us here today. This is Michael Conlon. And yes, I'd like to bring us through, sort of what is cybersecurity. So, Chris elaborated on a couple of different potential, threats and risks that are out there every day for us at all times. And some might be even as simple as internal policies and procedures and ensuring that we properly documented, the risks that are facing the firm, both externally and internally. Maybe perhaps we're storing information in a way that is in and of itself compromising our client security. So part of this is also an internal review and assessing what our needs are. So we start by first exploring what is cybersecurity. And cybersecurity is essentially the risk that we face by handling our clients' sensitive information. And in that just basic sentence, there's a lot of potential issues there, whether it's, training employees to ensure that we know what to do when we have it and how to handle it appropriately and respecting that privacy, to ensuring that we have the right tools on hand to defend against external threats or other communication streams as we work with our clients. It crosses, and so we have the human resource side of training and making sure that our people are handling these items appropriately. Vendor management and ensuring that we've done some diligence on the folks that we do business with to ensure that they're handling our clients' personal information appropriately and that they have the proper security measures in place. To our internal processes and how we're collecting that client information when they first become a client of our firm, where that is stored, how that is transmitted either among the firm itself or externally with our vendors, and then also how it's destroyed and how we handle it when we sort of end a client relationship. What do we do? How long do we have to keep it? What do we do with it when we don't need to keep it? And so all of that all together is ultimately cybersecurity.
So to add to that thought here, think of all your policies and procedures. So as your firm has evolved, you had probably an information technology policy. So how do we use our technology? You have a privacy policy. How do we share data? Depending on the nature of your business, you may have a red flags policy, or how do we know if we see an issue? Cybersecurity, if you think about this, is really the intersection of all of these policies together. And as our business is moving to a truly electronic format here, we have these risks, and they're overlapping, they're intersecting, or one may lead to one activity may lead to a risk of another. So we'll dig into this in a little bit more detail, but the most important thing here is when you look at your policies and procedures, is really think through, what are we actually doing? What are we doing, and how are we trying to accomplish these? There are certain rules and regulations that require you to have, a policy that meets a certain standard. But the way of looking at it is, do we really have 4 different policies, or do we have one cohesive policy that we just look at from a 360-degree view? And that's something we'll explore as we move along. So, the simplification of this is, where's our risk and how do we mitigate that risk? That's the lens we want to put on this as we move forward.
And certainly the risk is clearly in the lens and the scope of the regulators as well. So late last year in Q3, the SEC released a risk alert regarding cybersecurity, and trying to add some, at a high level, granted, but trying to add some structure around what they're looking for when they visit your firm, and they're reviewing your policies and procedures and your operations as it surrounds cybersecurity. So there's various factors that they're looking at here, which we sort of address already to some degree, and they're noted here in the slide, and kind of drawing from this sort of apparatus of what cybersecurity is from their perspective. They also had some charges they brought against an advisory firm who did not have any policies and procedures in place, and they were unfortunately the victim of a cybersecurity attack. Had some of their information compromised by hackers from China. Ultimately, they were traced back to China, and but that's not necessarily. We want to be able to. We want to have procedures in place to address any attack, whether it's internal, external, local, or abroad, and therefore this firm was unfortunately, sort of sanctioned and penalized as a result of the review by the regulators as a follow-up to this attack. So the risk alert gives us guidance and structure for how to move forward, and we also can see what happens when the regulators come visit and we don't necessarily have these things in place and we're not on top of cybersecurity from a compliance perspective. So the examiners observed that there was risk impacting this firm. The risk was not mitigated in any way by any of their policy procedures. They were not taking any reasonable steps to address the cybersecurity issue. And therefore, the result was for them to have consequences as a result of that. And of course, the regulators always issue priorities for their examiners every calendar year, and cybersecurity is among them. So as they move forward with exams since the September 2015 matter, they are looking for cybersecurity issues, and they are using this as part of their review. So we want to make sure that we have things in place to help address the risk, and that we're incorporating this as a part of our continuous review and improvement of our sort of life and compliance each year.
To add to the thought here, the advisory question, the firm was RT Jones. You can do a search on that, or Michael has the link at the bottom here. The best way to look at this is the firm, when the firm suspected that there was something wrong, they went out and hired professionals, And then it came back inconclusive. They went and hired another team of professionals or individuals. I'm not sure the extent of how many people and all those factors there wasn't made fully public. But they basically jumped right on it and took action. But the regulators basically said too little, too late. You should have had policies and procedures to know, in fact, that you had a breach, know when you have a breach, be able to identify the breach, and be able to take the systematic steps to correct the breach. So it's interesting that we're trying to, of course, make a point with this. They have the opportunity, of course, to create a learning well, I guess they did that either way, but they had a better opportunity out there to use this as a case study and not so much a fine and sanction. But of course, money draws headlines, so that's where that leaves us. But the key thing for the regulatory focus is it is in all of the exams now for 2016. So anyone that is receiving an SEC exam is part of their protocol. The vast majority of the states that are currently administering those exams are including it in their protocol as well. So it's really something that you need to have basically included and drafted in your policies, and also just think from a regulatory standpoint, if it's not documented, it didn't happen, right? So that holds true for all aspects of the regulatory framework. You need to be able to prove that you have in place the policies and you follow the policies, not just that you're smart and prudent business people that can sniff out a problem and take action. You need to be able to show that you have those policies already in place. So
exactly.
Sorry, Michael.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one final thought on this one, because this was a big deal when it came out back in September 2015, not too long ago, about 9 months ago or so. The industry was very upset that the regulators, came out, found this issue, and ultimately penalized the firm, because on paper it looked like the firm responded exactly how I would recommend any of us respond to a cybersecurity breach, by engaging consultants, validating, any client harm, communicating to clients, offering free credit monitoring to all their clients for, I think, a year. So looking at the situation, it looks like that the advisor responded exactly how anyone would want to respond to a potential cybersecurity breach. But what the regulators really focused on here was that they were unprepared before it happened. They did not have anything in place. They weren't taking any reasonable steps to verify the risk and address any potential risk in this topic. And that's really why the regulators, I think, went after this firm, was because they wanted to sort of also send a message to say, we need to be proactive on this situation. We can't just be reactive, because if we're being reactive, then we're not doing good by our clients. We're not necessarily upholding our fiduciary duty to sort of take reasonable steps to mitigate that risk, because we're not taking any steps at all. So I think that's really what the regulators focus on here, and why we try to incorporate information security and cybersecurity into our annual risk assessments, looking at vendor privacy policies and things of that nature. So really kind of being in front of the issue is what the regulators want us to be doing here.
I'm sure I have plenty of questions on this one, and the whole theme kind of comes together as we're hitting the other slides here as well, folks. So, how do you manage this from a firm governance standpoint? And policies are all well and good. Obviously, you need to start with policies, but as the regulators have communicated very clearly since 2004, when they implemented the CCO rule 20647 of the Advisors Act, it's tone at the top, and it's the corporate culture. So how does your firm think of all of its various risks and put in policies and controls to not only mitigate the risks, but to be able to identify them when you see either a breach, an enhancement, or someone just not fully following the approach or workflows that you've set forth for your policies and procedures. So that tone at the top is one of the key things that are there. And this can be all aspects of it. When the regulators come in, they can do everything from examine to just observe the general behavior of the business. So if you're the CCO or a senior member, and the SEC is seeing that you rush and email out Social Security numbers because you're too busy, well, they're going to look at it and say, well, what else is wrong here? So maybe there's no breach, or maybe we don't even know if there was a breach, but they are looking for potential risk. So leadership needs to walk the walk and talk the talk here. So making sure that their devices are secured and that they're communicating appropriately. And if the chief compliance officer, I should say more when the chief compliance officer is administering policies and certifications, the senior folks should be the first one to certify the documents, not the last one to certify the documents that are out there. On the training front, this is an area where you just can't spend enough time. Training your employees for where the various risks are, and the training can take many forms. It can just be describing and discussing policies and risks that you see out there. You can, test them, by, some firms use, to kind of illustrate the point, use fabricated emails to see if someone would, click through something that would expose the firm or client data. And obviously there's no risk at the other end of it because it was manufactured, but, what's the tendency is, will your employee click on anything put in front of them? If there's certain buzzwords, does it get people's attention and they jump in and take action without, looking at or evaluating the details? So there's a number of ways of getting to the training there. One of my personal favorites is to use, actual, as Michael just did with the regulatory issue here or the sanctions, but to use actual scenarios here to describe how things have, can materialize. There isn't more than a week or two that ever goes by where we don't get feedback on some attempt to fraudulently, move money or gain access to accounts or solicit information. So using those training methods for your clients is critical. I always use an example that's actually a live one, which you're all welcome to. You have my full editorial capabilities here, but a client had a hacked email account and emailed into the operations team of an advisor and said, and it was the perfect storm of events. So first of all, long gone are the days of, dear sirs, send me the money. It's going to be more well thought out, and proper sentence structure and analysis are going into these. So they're putting in some effort. Whether it's machine learning that's doing this, or you actually have a person, typing the fraudulent emails, we don't know. But a very quick example that we find useful is, a client had canceled one of their meetings, and the timing was perfect. So they canceled a meeting with the advisor right at the same time their email got hacked. So perhaps they were traveling, and maybe they were at Starbucks, maybe they were at the airport. We don't know the particulars there. But long story short, their AOL account got hacked, and the fraudster did their homework and said, hey, I'm traveling right now, but apologize to so and so, lead advisor, for me blowing off the meeting. Can you send me whatever paperwork I need to move money? I got to take care of a couple things here. And the person jumped right on it, sent over the paperwork. The paperwork came back with the signature, and no one actually checked it, but then when they did later on, it was actually relatively good, comparable to other things that were signed in the past. So think of this way: how many people have some specimen signature somewhere in their personal email? Things are shifted and shuffled back and forth all the time. It might not even be from your firm. Long story short, the person in operations put down their guard, and they didn't call, didn't verify. They went and processed it with the custodian and told the custodian that they called and they verified. So the custodian put down their guard and didn't call nor verify. And long story short, $90,000 walked out the door. And the really unfortunate part of the story is the following day, when the lead advisor was looking at his daily reports, noticed that $90,000 had left from his $1 million client, and thought in his deductive reasoning was, he blew off my meeting. Here's the first $90,000. He doesn't have the courage to call me and tell me that he's leaving me. So the advisor, in a harsh reaction, called the client to yell at the client. We all know where this went. It's from there. So, the advisor obviously had to go into E&O and to work with the custodian. They did a split, but basically, was out thousands of dollars and the $1 million client, and took a reputational hit. So we don't know. I'm telling this story generically. We don't know how many times that client's telling the story with the actual names. So that's the math on the risk here. And I'm sure many of you have that approach and that policy in place, that you always make that phone call. But sometimes it isn't about money movement. So it's just about information. And your firm might not be the primary target. You might be the secondary target or the facilitator of information. So they might not be going after the account at the custodian. They might be going at the bank account and just trying to get enough information from you so that they can validate over there. So you never know, and we just need to be as vigilant as possible and do all the requisite due diligence when information comes our way. So moving through these bullet points here, the roles and responsibilities. So do we have checks and balances? Do we look at risk at various levels, whether it's the size of a request or frequency, or do we just not take any risks and say anytime someone asks for any information that has personally identifiable information, account information, money movement, we have two people that look at it, the staff person and the chief compliance officer, if you have those resources. Those are things that you need to think through for your own policies and balance the ability to get through the day-to-day work with the risks of something being fraudulent along the way. Then from there, Michael had mentioned risk assessments and testing. That you really need to look at, how do we know that we're doing a good job? So here's a playbook, and hopefully we all follow it. But what are the outcomes? How do we measure it? How do we know that we're following it? And how do we know that everybody is consistently following it on our team? Those are the areas where it's tough to always get into a policy. So the perpetual review or oversight of those policies and that feedback loop from your team is imperative to make sure that you're continuing to enhance those policies. And lastly, what are the consequences? I had one CCO of an advisor that stated as part of their annual meeting that we participated in recently that said, our policy is simple. And this happened to be just about money movement, but it creates a good example. Validate whatever you want, but if you make a mistake, you're paying for it. So that's the way one advisor phrased it. You may have a different approach, but there's you need to have some measurement point, or how do you make sure that your policies are taken seriously? So Michael will take you through Reg SP and the protection of sensitive data here.
Yep. So cybersecurity is not a specific rule that was promulgated by the SEC or is in a particular act. But what we have is Regulation SP, and that is the specific rule that all of these sort of cybersecurity regulatory concerns from the risk alert, as mentioned earlier, and published in 2015, focus on. So Reg SP has very broad language, and it says that you're required to protect sensitive data. What does protect mean, and what does sensitive data mean? Those are sort of obvious follow-up questions. And since Reg SP has come out, we've sort of gotten some direction on that. So protecting ultimately means taking reasonable steps to ensure that the data is not accessible or sort of capable of being manipulated or changed or altered by an unauthorized third party. And sensitive data is primarily focusing on our client data, which talks, has sort of information about the client, whether it's the personally identifiable information of their sort of date of birth, social security number, account numbers, things of that nature, or it's actually sort of the account holdings information itself of our clients. This is sort of the sensitive information we want to make sure we're protecting. And of course, in our client relationships, that can even be broadened even further to, information that we obtain from their lawyer or their accountant, certainly, sort of a trustee relationship and things of that nature, create additional scope. It sort of enhances the scope of what we're trying to protect. And a lot of this can be simplified with our sort of more digital landscape of our modern age. So we have, we can protect at the disk level, so that any client data that we have is protected, that it's stored on that disk, and we don't have to worry about necessarily whether a specific folder is protected versus another. But that gets into the sort of the details here. So at a high level, we want to make sure that our office itself is secure, that if there's a lock on the door that gets locked at night, and then when it's unlocked during business hours, that there's somebody near the door who could observe someone who's walking into the office before they can turn around and get their hands on that file cabinet or that data server, for example. So we want to be able, the handling of the flow of people through our office is part of our cybersecurity issues, because that can compromise our protection of our client-sensitive data if we don't have a secure handling of our office environment. And certainly, as I mentioned in our digital context, encryption and networking is a priority here. So we want to make sure that we've taken appropriate steps to password protect or encrypt our disks, as mentioned, and access to different resources from a technological standpoint. Also, store data on hard drives, if it's internal or external, should perhaps potentially apply encryption, especially if it's being transmitted either physically by walking out the door or over the network by means of electronic transmission, uploads and downloads using Dropbox or another sort, or Google Drive or another sort of online remote storage will trigger cybersecurity issues, because in the transmission of that data from point A to point B, and also the storage of that data at point B, we want to make sure that we've addressed and assessed the protection of that data appropriately. Another sort of aspects in which you could consider for protecting our sensitive data is how do we access those systems? I mentioned passwords, but are those passwords permitted to be very basic? Can password be your password? Is there also an opportunity for two-factor authentication, which we use here at AdvisorAssist, so that when we log in and submit our passwords to get into our systems, there's an additional step we have to take. Sometimes this is known as something you have and something you know. So historically, there were the RSA keys that you plugged into the USB port that then, was something that you had, and then you also had to know the password in addition to that. So these are different ways in which we can layer and increase the protection of our sensitive data. We want to also be aware of various ways in which we can enter into our information technology systems, whether that's, whether someone can simply download an attachment or a piece of software that they can then install on their computer, whether that's a browser plugin or an app itself. We want to make sure that we're authorizing potentially the software that we're using and reviewing the security concerns for that software before we implement it in our operations, so that we can have the opportunity to perform that security diligence on that provider of that software and ensure it's coming from a reliable and secure source. And I also mentioned the unauthorized distribution outside of the firm. So the opportunity to email something to your clients as an attachment is a very tangible way of getting that information to your client, but it might not necessarily be a secure method if we're talking about some sensitive data that we're trying to email to them. So engaging a firm for encrypted transmission of email, as the regulators always use when they communicate to their clients and request items from you during an examination. They'll set up a secure encrypted communication methodology to obtain that information for their review. And then, of course, if all of our reasonable steps here were not sufficient, and we did ultimately have a breach, which is a part of our reality. I like to say that if anyone tells you that they can give you 100% security and sort of guarantee that you will be secure, it's probably because they're trying to sell you something. So we do have to have a procedure in place and be aware of what we're going to do if there is a breach, because perhaps it's not a matter of if so much as when. And we want to make sure that when is as far into the future as possible. However, we need to also be prepared to respond to breaches, whether that's engaging a consultant to investigate the breach, self-investigation of the breach, and then developing the communications to the client and making sure that we're taking the right steps to move forward with the client and try to preserve that relationship as much as possible. I think that's sort of the nutshell of how we want to try to protect our sensitive data.
And one of the questions we often get is, what's more secure? Having physical on-premise servers and technology and our own closed network, or leveraging, a public cloud and secure cloud-based technologies out there. And the short answer is, the one that doesn't get hacked is going to be the best answer, right? It's the one where you don't have the breach. And the experts can continue to debate this time and time again. My general thought and approach is, most of you on the phone here are probably not technology experts, and even ourselves here at AdvisorAssist, we're very technology literate, but we're not technology experts. So we seek vendors and partners who are technology experts, and one of the and we're going to place reliance on, but not without testing, their ability to deal with these various risks. And I very clearly was trying to point out that we have to test and validate. But having partners that are very focused on information security and data security and all aspects of networks and intrusion into those networks, you're often going to find, if for firms that have just a few people working for them, that's often your best option. Now, certainly there are firms that get to scale that have dedicated internal technology resources and someone whose job it is to review and monitor on a moment by moment basis, not just daily, the health of the network, who's logging in, who's not logging in, who's transferring data. Absent those resources, we think it's prudent to be partnering with firms that are those experts. Again, the key thing there is, of course, if it's internal, there's other aspects that you may want to do to test. So if you have control over the servers, you may want to engage someone, an expert, to try to do intrusion. Folks, could we please mute our lines here as well? I think
you've been muted. To unmute yourself, press the star key twice.
So on the intrusion testing front, if you own your own servers, we think it's a very practical aspect to hire a technology consultant to basically try and do that intrusion testing. If you're trying to utilize a third-party provider, or your custodian is Schwab, Fidelity, TD, or others, you definitely do not want to hire someone to try to break into a custodian bank, right? Those are the things that will go very wrong. Should you be trying to do your due diligence and prove that no one can access this. So it brings us back to, we have to place some reliance on these third parties, and we have to look at whether they have, SSA 16 audit reports, Google alerts as to whether or not any of our partners have had breaches or anything to be concerned about, and just remain apprised of the risks that are out there for each of our firms and the way our profile is set up with them. One of the best ways of going about this is really just taking an inventory of all of your partners and trying to put them in a risk assessment or risk category. So, for instance, a provider of a service that has your private data, where they have vast teams and backup and data centers and SSA 16 reports, those are the things that you would first gravitate to. But you don't end there. You need to do additional due diligence on those. For firms that have multi-factor, 2 or more factors of authentication, if you have that enabled and everyone in your team is using that, that should give you a lot more comfort and check a little less frequently than the firm that doesn't have multi-factor authentication or would allow you to use password as the password. And often our weakest links here, just as I'm sure you may know, is our regulators. So our taxing authorities, our regulators, our securities and corporate divisions there generally have outdated systems. So the states have, they're struggling with their resources. The Commonwealth of Mass last year did an overall training for advisors, and the head of security for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts got up and spoke with everybody, and you can see the fear in his face. I think the poor gentleman's afraid to go to work every day, knowing that all their computers are out of date. They're all on old XP computers, and he can't even patch them. He can't even put the software on them if he wanted to and had the budget to go do that. So we never know. The point is we just don't know where the risk is coming from. And the only thing that we can do is just remain on top of this topic and continuing to just think through where's our data, how and where does it go, and just kind of step through, the prudent aspects of how do I seek to protect that data and what would I do if I found something wrong.
Yeah, and Chris, you bring up another great point that you mentioned there about responding appropriately to breaches. And this is something that I try to mention to all of my clients in my calls on information security, which is, you need to be aware of breaches at your vendors. Yeah, so setting up the alerts and being aware of when, for example, if you work with Fidelity and Fidelity gets hacked, is that impacting your clients at all? And what is Fidelity doing about it? And have they reasonably made a response and resolution to that breach and that issue? If they haven't, then you need to sort of, assess that, put that into some context, and consider whether or not it becomes then time to find a different vendor. And of course, I'm just using Fidelity as an example, but in order to fully uphold our duty to our clients, we need to make sure that, we're not creating risk for them by working with someone who isn't giving, sort of a reasonable level of respect to this topic. And as I was saying, I don't think anyone is 100% secure. Last year we saw, the JP Morgan, Home Depot, and many others have security breaches that caused problem for their clients. And we need to make sure that we're on top of that for the vendors that we work with, not just our own internal, networking and encryption, things of that nature, but also doing some due diligence on folks that we do business with that is storing our sensitive data. And then also, if any of those vendors have a breach or a security issue, to then also, perhaps reperform that diligence, consider any additional questions, and potentially, reevaluating that relationship overall.
And lastly, evaluating your vendors that are helping you to meet your cyber risks there. I saw one of our clients here has joined this call, and they'll appreciate that they were being solicited by a cybersecurity firm, and when we went to the cybersecurity's website, their website was hacked. So it's, the point is there's no absolutes here, and it's going to be a moving target that we all have to remain, focused on and do our own
the data. So when we have it in our possession, what are we doing on an ongoing basis to make sure that it is protected? And then when we no longer have the burden of needing that data, what do we do with it? We can't just, put it in the recycling bin or take the hard drive out, and put it in the garbage. We need to make sure that we're taking the appropriate steps to securely destroy that data. And this is also another requirement of Reg SP. So Reg SP has a requirement of protecting data that's in our possession, and it also has a requirement of protecting data that we're removing from our possession and seeking to destroy. So from the physical file sense, this is pretty obvious. We want to make sure that it's being shredded or essentially being discarded in a way that doesn't leave it in its original state and legible. Burning is kind of no longer popular these days, but shredding it would satisfy, and so would shredding. So we see a lot of relationships with shredding service and things of that nature. And of course, you want to be careful when you're even using a shredding service, whether that means you're watching them shred it because they bring the truck up to your door, or it's shredded before it goes into their possession. You want to just be careful that you're not, sort of handing over the stack of paperwork in its original state, and then they walk out the door with it before it's actually been shredded. But you want to be able to ensure that you've taken the steps to destroy the data in the context of discarding it and removing it from your possession. So essentially, what's being removed from your possession should no longer be client personal information. It should be sort of a pile of shreds of paper or something to that effect, and no longer in its legible state. And then from the technological side, this gets a little tricky too, because something that I also try to mention on my calls on this topic is that when you delete a file on your computer, you did not remove that data from your computer. The way that deleting typically works in an operating system is that it removes the reference to where that data is stored on your disk drive. So you have a series of ones and zeros that comprise client personal information, and your computer knows that when you want to open that client's, the PDF scan of their tax returns, that's going to point to that set of data on your disk. Well, when you delete that file, it removes the pointer, so the computer no longer has an association of where to look to get that file. But that file is still there, and it can be retrieved. Just in the same way that if you have a disk that dies or goes bad, how do you recover the data from that disk? Well, just because some parts of it are corrupted and no longer usable, that data is still sitting there. So it's important to ensure that there are secure ways to delete files, and essentially what it does is it scrubs the data and replaces it with different values, and sort of tries to randomize the data that's on the disk. So this is an important thing to have in mind when we're talking about deleting and securely destroying sensitive data on our hard drives. You might want to consider engaging a security an IT vendor to facilitate that sort of wipe and delete process. There are certain applications you can get from the internet for that purpose, but again, we want to make sure that we're using a secure vendor for that purpose. So this is a sort of more of a basic service, despite the intricacy that a lot of IT vendors do provide. So certainly a good component when evaluating whether or not you have a good IT vendor, or if you're in the process of choosing one. Something that perhaps is overlooked from a lot of due diligence is, can you help me securely destroy files and data in my possession? And of course, if it is in your possession, it also leaves you subject to review and scrutiny from the regulators. So there is the books and records requirement of preserving certain information for 5 years at the end of the fiscal year in which the record was last made. And in this case, if you go beyond that sort of minimum requirement of duration of which you're preserving the record, it is still subject to review. Just because you're not required to keep it doesn't mean the regulators are prevented from inspecting it. So in order to sort of keep the risk overall in a minimal state, we do recommend that you destroy what you can destroy on a sort of a schedule. And if it's sort of deemed to be irrelevant because you're no longer with that client or something to that effect, you wouldn't want to follow through and try to scrub the disk of unnecessary data that's no longer relevant for your business or your compliance for your books and records. So those are kind of the two main ways in which you want to pursue that, whether it's a physical file or it's a digital file on the hard drive disk there.
And just to add to that, think of course of if you have cloud-based systems, so you need to look into what is the policies for the various cloud-based vendors if you either remove data from the system or you cease to become a client of theirs. So if you just decide it's no longer a system for you, how do you that's appropriate for you? What's the unwinding of your data? So identifying and assessing your risks. We've alluded to this throughout the session here, but the policy you first have to know what you're focused on. So what's your business model look like? How are you obtaining data? How do you transfer, use, and process data? So is it internal on your own servers? Is it on cloud-based systems? Are you transmitting stuff or getting data feeds from your custodians? How do your clients all come to your office, or do you do things in a remote manner, or both, for all of those? Do you have desktops versus laptops? And if there's a laptop, are they encrypted? Do you access information from your handheld devices? So, for instance, you could have we see this quite a bit, those that have encrypted laptops and high security, multi-factor authentication, complex passwords getting into the laptop, and then someone can jump on their iPhone with no password, no encryption, and click on an icon and grab all the same data from the back end. So you can basically, someone could pull your phone out of your bag at an airport and have all the same data that they wouldn't be able to get to if they, broke into your office and stole all your equipment. So you need to make sure that we're not locking the front door and leaving the window open. Identifying the potential risks that are out there. Obviously, virus software and other controls are important. But we talked along the way about some of the physical checkpoints of knowing your customer and validating the information. So really validating that you are, in fact, corresponding with or sharing information with whom you think you are before you actually do it. That's the best way to be on the lookout for any suspicious activity. On the IT side, we talked about an inventory of all your internal and external systems. So where is my data? And the good thing is, this is something you need to do from a regulatory standpoint on maintaining where your books and records are anyway. So it's really an extension of your books and records matrix. What tools and technology do I use? And just do this in a format that you can have it as a leverageable tool to help you think through which ones have higher risk than others, which ones have personal information, which ones have, which systems don't have multi-factor authentication, or there's some difference on a per-user basis as to how it might be configured. And hopefully there's never the breach. Again, if it happens, always with any error that you have in your business, it's, first do whatever you can to contain the error. Make sure the client's not harmed or it's identified and no further harm will happen. And then start to figure out, how did it happen? How do we prevent it from happening? And is there any communication, remediation, anything that's necessary there to correct the situation? On the remote access, so we've talked and made mention of airports and Starbucks and other places here. This really depends on the type of network that you're structured. So if you have your own internal network, you need to have a secure method of accessing that network remotely, based on just the natural way folks work and need to interact with data these days. So you need a secure virtual private network connection into your own servers. And if you don't, the natural thing is you end up putting stuff on, call it temporarily on your computers, but that often never makes it back to its permanent spot, and it's structured, where the flow of data is, and how and where you would access those is imperative. And even if you're using public cloud-based systems where there's an encrypted connection, there could still be someone sitting there at Starbucks that's logging your keystrokes, just sitting on the same insecure network. So there's services and applications that you can install on your computers so that that is, I don't want to say not possible, less likely, we'll use as the terminology here, to ensure that you're not sitting there with an open computer that's cascading out your identity and allowing anybody to remotely connect. So many Windows and/or Mac machines actually come out of the box, kind of family friendly, I should say, so that, it's expected that you want to be able to share your photos, share your music, and have multiple people utilize those. So often the default settings for these computers are, let anybody in the network see me. So you pop onto the Wi-Fi at Starbucks, and virtually anybody there can go start cruising through all of your data and all of your files, and/or put an application and drop it right on your computer that will start recording your keystrokes. So these are some very simple things that even a non-technology professional could implement on their computers just by doing some, quick Google searches and, taking your machine and tightening up the basics of security. So moving along here, we talked a little bit about the fund transfers, so we'll, we won't dig into that. Hopefully you all have policies there, but really just recognize that you might not be the primary target. You might be just being, used as an information proxy to get the real target. So just make sure we're truly authenticating with the people in which we're communicating. If it's through some other, other than them sitting across the table, know your customer and making sure that we're truly validating, verbally and/or other means. Some firms go as far as having a personal code that people have to tell them, whether it's a specific identifier or some other methodology. Just make sure that you have those policies that you can live up to. Michael, why don't you wrap up on vendor management here?
Yeah, absolutely. And when you're talking about the family-friendly product out of the box, to me, I think that the initial configuration of our settings for our technology devices is almost like the ground zero of cybersecurity, because that's where we have the opportunity before any complicated data or client stuff gets on our laptop or any device. We have the opportunity to try to set up those initial barriers and the restrictions, and so in some degrees, in some ways, that's almost like probably one of the top priorities is making sure that your settings are right out of the box, so that when you hand it off to the employee and they start rolling with it, that you've already mitigated a lot of potential issues there, and then it becomes potentially training and watching out for flags thereafter. And so back in vendor management here, as we were saying before, we want to make sure that the companies and the people that we work with, to get our business to do what we need to do for our clients is paramount, and we need to make sure that we're performing initial diligence on our vendors before they get their hands on that information. Again, that's that initial setup to some degree. And then from an ongoing perspective, we want to make sure that we're getting a copy of their privacy policy and reviewing any changes, and if they have sort of a elaborate security page that they can sort of evidence and prove that they're doing what they say they do on that page to some degree, whether that's providing reports and other things, and able to sort of validate, from an ongoing standpoint, that our vendors are properly handling and storing and transmitting our confidential client information. So we want to make sure that we're any risks that are created from the vendor relationship, that we're incorporating those into our review, whether that's access, transmission, storage, things of that nature. We want to make sure that we're checking on those points to make sure that they are being used appropriately. And of course, the relationship should be in writing. to some degree with our vendors. We want to make sure that there's language in there and in terms of our relationship that touch on confidentiality and the standards that they're sort of saying that they do enforce, in their security disclosures or reports. It might be worth trying to get some of that, into our contracts that we actually have, that they're going to have a cybersecurity or information security plan in place that they're using, and that they'll provide reports on an at least annual basis, for example. It might be sort of a term you could request from perhaps one of the larger firms, or even some of the mid-sized and smaller ones as well. Supervising the vendors and making sure access is appropriate, so that everyone doesn't need access to the custodian's account, for example, or something to that effect. To the platform tool to manage client assets. Obviously that should be restricted to those that need that access. And additionally, training and ensuring that, as Chris was saying, training is sort of a very ongoing and broad scope type of issue that we want to make sure that we're capturing. So for people that are using the vendors, if they need to be trained on, sort of what flags to look for or concerns that they should escalate from a security or compliance perspective, then that might be an appropriate aspect of the training for that group of folks. And of course, making sure that we're keeping good documentation about these issues. Certainly if there's an issue or a dispute that arises, a complaint or anything like that, or some observed potential security issue or breach, that we are documenting that appropriately, and also perhaps documenting our response to it, so that we can demonstrate that, well, what did you do when this happened? You want to be able to field the answer on that question. Well, when that happened, we first documented that it did happen, and then we took these appropriate steps to address the concern. We found out that it was not an issue, and we have all the records related to that, the progression of that issue through our firm and the resolution of it. So kind of putting all that together is how we want to manage our vendors in a cybersecurity context. And we've talked about assessment and identifying issues. We've talked about a couple of different particulars of very common issues that we see, and of course the protection and the secure destruction of our data. And this all comes together in our written policies and procedures. We need to be addressing sort of the totality of cybersecurity, at least at a high level, and then getting into the particulars of how those different pieces impact our firm in our policies and procedures. And this might come out to becoming a standalone cybersecurity policy, or sort of an integrated component of our compliance manual in some way. And potentially also, the code of ethics, to the extent we want our individual people to sort of, take any specific action to uphold cybersecurity as well. So we have a variety of different, risks that are apparent here in the cybersecurity context, and we should endeavor to capture those risks and how we're controlling those risks in our written policies and procedures. So if we have a requirement for encrypting any disk that is external, or that stores personal client information, then the control would obviously be to encrypt those disks to address the risk of the potential breach by someone accessing it, and not having that additional security burden of also beating the encryption on that disk. The policy procedures should also capture how we're going to ultimately respond to a breach, whether that's sort of notifying law enforcement, communicating with clients, refunds, or things of that nature, engaging a consultant who is an expert in cybersecurity. Those are a variety of different responses to a cybersecurity breach, and I think that we don't necessarily need to map out a specific breach and a specific response to it, but we need to sort of be able to explain in our policy procedures, what we could consider or potentially do in response to a cybersecurity breach. And I think, as we move along with our cybersecurity policy procedures, if we do have a specific breach that creates a specific response, then we might want to consider updating and revising our cybersecurity policy procedures to reflect that, especially if it's a recurring issue. For example, with the unauthorized distribution of client assets, in that example with the spoofed email, that might be a specific cybersecurity issue or risk that gets a specific control in our policies and procedures, as an example. And we also want to be, reviewing and testing those cybersecurity, those policy procedures as they apply to cybersecurity on an at least annual basis to make sure that it's properly addressing the risks that we've encountered over time, which might change. It might just grow, but there might be some that are so remote or that get addressed by the way we do business that it no longer becomes a risk, which would be great. And of course, state registered advisors want to make sure that we have a written information security program where applicable that addresses either a reference to or perhaps is a part of our cybersecurity policies and procedures.
Great, thanks, Michael. So we're running long on time, folks. In summary on the policies, I think the most important thing is to make sure they're reflective of what you're capable of doing. So as the rules evolve, you have to meet what the rule requires, but don't overreach. Don't say you're going to do something that you either don't have the skills to do or can't consistently do. So start with what you can, and then test it, and validate, and improve it as you move along here. And of course, the rules will guide what that minimum is along the way as well. But we obviously want to strive for what's protecting the firm. I'll quickly run through the action item summary here, but we'll take some questions. So I know we're already over, but please feel free, anyone who wants to stick around for any additional questions that you might have. We'll do our best to answer them. And as Brian mentioned earlier, we're also recording the total coverage here. So if you have to jump for another meeting, feel free to pick up the responses there and circle back with us if you have any questions on what we say on those items here. But just in summary, it's, we need to have policies and procedures. We need to have our systematic controls, and we need to know what everyone's roles and responsibilities are. And as evidenced by the R.T. Jones matter with the SEC, if it's not written, it didn't happen. So they look at it as preparedness, as forethought and documentation, and then the execution is you're taking your best efforts and ensuring no one's harmed, of course, in the execution of those policies. And then lastly, under 20647 of the Advisors Act, we'll call it the kitchen sink of regulation for a registered investment advisor. It's the CCO's responsible to ensure that there's a compliance program that's effective in its design to prevent, detect, and correct any violations of the securities laws, and you must assess it at least annually. So that's kind of their catch-all way of ensuring that you do all the things you need to. And oh, by the way, as a fiduciary, wouldn't you have to do all these things? They always have that in their pocket as well. So let's take a few questions here. Brian, do you have? You want to start us off with that?
Sure.
So one of the questions here, how secure are faxes? Very, very good question, because think of it this way. Most faxes have moved. They're generally no longer going across, the plain old telephone service line, and have moved into moved across into either email and internet-based forms. So as Michael mentioned, that the zeros and ones out there. Generally, a fax is really what it's doing is being converted out of its analog form into digital data, and then converted back into analog form to print out a fax along the way. So there are secure fax services that do things in an encrypted manner, but the vast majority of them are no more secure than email, and one could argue even less secure than email, because the data that a fraudster could be basically out there with a sniffing application, looking for things that have fax as basically a description, or even of various types that are in the message type. So we think faxes are very insecure. One of the other areas of things that are very insecure I look at a lot of the banks and custodians still email out statements that have personal information on them, which I find astounding. It's, everyone's worried about something being cut, being via an email transmission, but we're going to mail something with the letterhead of a financial institution and say, hey, here's all the information you need. So, I look at that as, we're not just looking at the IT world here for breaches that can come from any angle.
Just wanted to add quickly onto the fax question. Especially concerning our faxes that go over an internet connection. So typically a fax is a circuit-based point-to-point connection similar to an old school phone call. But now if you're using sort of a voice over IP service that has a fax, what you're talking about there is an unencrypted transmission over the internet. So that is tantamount to a plain text email that has no security controls on it, and the attachment is the fax that you're sending. So especially insecure are those internet-based faxes unless they have some additional encryption or other security layer added to it.
Great point. Any other questions that you have, folks? Feel free to come off of mute and ask any questions.